When I was 14, the desire for fame and fortune had already struck its roots into my psyche. And when I heard that big money was being made at Coons' potato farm, my ears perked right up, and I made sure I got over there on the day when they were going to pick potatoes. I rode my bike over there about 7 in the morning, and it was roughly a 5-mile ride, and it was pretty cold too. It was below freezing, and there were a group of women standing around waiting for instructions, and they didn't look at me with any great pleasure because they knew I was going to be taking some of their hard-earned opportunity for vast fortune. But I was determined to participate. So when Mr. Coons came out, he gave each one of us instructions, and we were assigned an area and with a bag and a box. But he had a little present for us that morning. Because the mud was frozen and sticking to potatoes, he threw in a penny a bushel bonus for knocking off the frozen chunks from the potato. He didn't want any frozen mud stuck onto the potatoes. And then he was willing to pay this vast improved salary to be sure that he got his way. So, that was a welcome bit of news to me, and it sounded like a pretty promising day. So got out in the field, and I found quickly that the mud stuck to the potato really did stick, and it was frozen, and I had to make some extra effort to knock it off. And in doing that, that frozen ground did nothing to warm my fingers, to say the least. So I struggled with that, and I could see that my fortune was not going to be made in the potato picking field. But I stuck with it, and it warmed up some, and the potatoes started to come free without having to do the extra work. So that day I picked 60 bushels, and I earned a grand total of $6 for the picking and 60 cents for the bonus. $6.60 that day. And it was a hard, back-breaking day, too. But in any case, the women were unhappy with me the whole day because I had taken $6.60 out of the pool of available money, and there were only a certain number of potatoes that were there, so I decided that I didn't need the money as much as they did, and so I didn't go back the next day. During that winter, I heard that the brickyard was hiring, even though it was 20 miles away, and I was only 15. I decided to make an effort to get a job there. They paid big bucks there. There were several guys who were a couple of years older than me that were working there, and they went to high school too, and they were telling me about getting a job at the brickyard. So I asked one of them to get me an application for employment there, and I went to the school office and I got a work permit. No one in the industry could hire you if you were under 16. I got my permit all right, but the permit was filled in with ink, and the permit had yellow paper. The only problem was that the little box that had my birth year as 1929 had to read 1928. So I had to concoct a plan to change that error. The plan was to go to McQuarrie's 5 and 10 cent store and buy an ink eradicator set. It cost 50 cents for the 2 little square bottles with an eyedropper as a stop in them. The directions were very clear. You applied 2 drops of potion from bottle A on the surface of the area you want removed, and wait 30 seconds, and then apply 2 drops of secret potion B on the same area, and the ink would disappear. I followed the directions very specifically, and sure enough, the ink disappeared, just as advertised. However, an associated problem they didn't mention was that it took the yellow out of the paper, and so the framework of the document had black lines, and where I'd applied this potion, there was still black lines outlining the box where the date was, but the yellow disappeared in a large area around that box and stood out like a sore thumb. You couldn't miss it, especially that specific area that was so important. So I was pretty crushed at that development. However, I decided to proceed on with it anyway. And my mother's writing was similar, so she scrawled 1928 in that box, and I took it out to the dirt road in front of our house, and I just rubbed that whole paper into the dirt and wrinkled it all up, made a mess out of it, which was the object. But the white still was, yeah, that didn't cover the white spot. So anyway, I decided, what the heck, what did I have to lose? So I took a straight pin and I pinned the application to the front of the permit, and I hitched a ride to the factory with the guys that drove there every day. This factory was built certainly before World War One, and it was very decrepit and labor intensive and inefficient, but it was wartime and those kind of things were not most important. They made fire brick there for the steel mills in Pittsburgh, and those steel mills were running night and day with the war effort, and so it was an important industry, an important factor in the rearmament and providing necessary equipment for our men. I knew that vaguely, but I didn't realize the pressure on those brickyard people to make sure that they kept the fire bricks in production so that the steel mills wouldn't be deprived of a vital part of their equipment. I went in this shaggy office door, and I walked down this hall. Everything was dirty and old, and there was a window in the side of the wall with a little arc cut out of the bottom where it rested against the sill. I looked through the window, and it was dirty, of course, but I could see some people working in their desks, and I made a little comment or something and attracted the guy that was sitting nearest me there, and he turned around, got up, and took my application and permit. I fully expected him to scrutinize it and tell me to go home, but instead of that, he never looked at it. He just grabbed it, stuffed it in the drawer of his desk, and he said, "Come on, follow me." So I followed him outside and across some cinder field there and into another big building, and he took me over to a station there where there was a Morris scale. Morris scale was an industrial scale with weights that you slid back and forth to get the weight. The platform of that scale was almost level with the floor. There was so much dust piled around it that you could barely see the steel platform where the bags were supposed to be placed. And everywhere in that building, every roof truss and supporting member of that building had an incline of dust. It wasn't anything that wasn't layered in ancient and constantly renewed dust. The chute was made out of 4 boards that were nailed together, and it had a slide shut-off at the end. And he said, what you do is take this paper bag off this pile here and you stick it under this chute, and you pull the slide, and when you get 80 pounds into the bag, you shut the chute off and you gather the top of the bag together with your hands and wrap the wire around it, and take this tool and twist the wire tight so that the bag is buttoned up tight. Then you place the bag on a pallet over here, and you do it again. That's the job. So I did. I got the bag and put it on a scale under the chute and pulled the slide open, and whoomph, a chunk of this powdery, gray, heavy stuff fell out of the chute and into the bag, and of course it made a bag blast like Hiroshima. All that dust blew back out of the bag and all over everything, all over me, and filled the air. It was terrible. But anyway, I managed to put 80 pounds in it and button up the first one the way he told me, and I twisted the wire tight so it would be sealed. But I couldn't pick it up. The bag was so tight, I couldn't crush the bag into the material and get a grip on it. So I had to reach down and wrap my arms around it and hold it tight against my chest. And I staggered over to the pallet and placed it on the pallet. This photograph, taken less than a year before my brickyard experience, shows what a bag of bones I was, and I'm amazed that I could lift an 80-pound bag. And I wasn't much bigger the year following this, because my uniform that I got when I went on the lakes fit this muscular body. I hadn't done much in terms of growth in that period. But I was not too concerned about it. I had a job. That was a big thing. I was making money for the first time in my life. I did that until lunchtime, but I began to cough this gray slime, and my lungs began to feel really heavy and uncomfortable. And the more I did it, the worse it got. My lungs just filled with this dust. By lunchtime, I had made up my mind that I had to quit. They didn't give me a face mask or anything, and I didn't think to ask for one. I didn't even know there was such thing as a face mask. So at lunchtime, when the bell rang, I went over to the foreman and I told him I was going to have to quit because I couldn't breathe anymore, and I was coughing this gray slime. Well, he really went off in the ballistic atmosphere. Called me all kinds of names, called me a lazy SOB, a worthless piece of shit, and yeah. he really was ticked because he couldn't find anybody to do that job. That was the problem. And I found out later that material was used as a mortar. It was mixed with water and used with mortar to hold the fire bricks in place inside the steel mill furnaces. And so it was a vital part of the necessity of keeping the steel mills going. But the process to package that stuff was just a real bugger for them. But anyway, he said, come on, I'll show you, and I'll take you over here and you can do this other job then. So we walked over into another building, and it was clear. There wasn't any dust in there or anything. And he took me over to this machine, and the job was called slopping out. And it consisted of a machine with an operator who mixed water with clay composition stored in bins above this machine. And this machine consisted of a large pan, perhaps 12 feet in diameter, driven by a huge bull gear. I remember the teeth on that gear were worn to a razor edge, but this gear must have been 5 or 6 feet in diameter. He would drop this clay into the pan and open a valve and let water come in, and there was a plow inside the pan that mixed the material. And when it reached the consistency of very thick concrete, he'd drop the plow down inside in a certain manner, and the plow then would throw the material out of the pan onto a steel table that was about 2 feet high off the floor. And we were standing at the edge of that table with shovels, and we each had an old wheelbarrow that was decrepit beyond belief. The wheel was iron and bent and hadn't the axle hadn't been oiled in maybe never. And so we shoveled this wet, heavy clay mixture into the wheelbarrow. I later estimated it was about 500 pounds. And then we had to push that load down a long, narrow building where the floor was heated with steam pipes that were embedded into the concrete. And the floor was all chipped and cracked, and some places the pipe had come through the concrete. So it was pretty difficult to avoid the big voids in the surface of the floor. But if you got in one too deep, then you couldn't get out of it, and created more problems. But anyway, we'd wheel that stuff down through this maze of potholes to the end of the building and dump this stuff on the floor. And we proceeded to do that for about a week at a time. So at the end of the week, this big floor was filled with these piles of drying material. This building was a kind of a lean-to against the main building, and it had a metal roof, and it was pretty hot in there in the summer because the sun beat down on the roof. But adding to the discomfort was the fact that the baking kilns were immediately outside, and they were glowing red hot. At night they glowed. You could see the dull red glow of the whole kiln. And so, of course, they introduced a lot of heat into that workplace. Anyway, as I said, we'd slop out wet stuff for about a week, and then we'd go back with picks and break this hardened material into chunks of various sizes that we could shovel into the wheelbarrow and wheel back to a hole in the floor that had an endless belt conveyor in the bottom of it, a little pit, and it conveyed the material up to bins high above the floor and through a crusher and then into the press that made 4 bricks at a time. So that was the process of this slopping out position that I was promoted to. But it was a job, and I could do it. I did it, and you know, it wasn't a lot of fun, but it was a job. The stuff that went through the press had made the bricks then had to be handled. Those guys that wheeled the bricks over outside into the kilns had a special wheelbarrow. I've never seen one before or since, but the wheel was suspended with 2 large leaf springs from the front of the wheelbarrow back toward the center of the bottom of the wheelbarrow where the bricks were stacked. And that put the wheel at the center of gravity when the wheelbarrow was loaded. They hauled about 180 green bricks right out of the press. And they had to wheel these out through the side of the building, through a doorway, onto a path that was laid with various pieces of board that, well, was rotted or split or whatever that kept the wheelbarrow from sinking into the mud. These guys had to wheel that stuff. That was a very heavy load. Those fellows had to wheel that load out to the kilns, and sometimes the kilns were a long way from the press. And they had to wheel it along this path, this terrible path that's full of old boards had been there for years and rotted partially and holes in them and stuff. And they had to do it without spilling these bricks. And they did that by holding the handles down as close to the ground as possible and running with that load. By moving fast and holding the handles down low, the wheel could hit whatever object was in their way and spring up and over and not upset the load. If they were going too slow, the center of gravity would be stopped there on the spot. The rotational energy of that load would throw the operator right over the load and ruin all the bricks. So it was a very important task for the operator to keep those handles low and run with his load. I only saw one wreck, but it's amazing that they could wheel so many thousands of bricks without damage or injury to the person. When they got to the kiln with the brick, the kilns had already been unloaded, obviously, so the kiln workers would then begin to reload the bricks. And they worked on piecework. Everybody else at the plant was on hourly work. But these guys were paid by the number of bricks they moved in and out of the kilns. And so they worked like maniacs, and it was hot in those kilns. They didn't wait till they cooled off before they reloaded them. The stacker would stack precisely the way they had to be stacked in order to permit hot air to blow through the pile and bake them all about the same time and speed. The wheelbarrow man threw 4 bricks at a time to the stacker, and the stacker would stack those bricks 4 at a time, and without pausing, turn and grab the next 4 in midair. They both worked without looking at each other, basically. The tosser would toss 4 at a time as fast as he could. He'd toss 4, and they'd be in the air, and he'd be grabbing 4 more, and the stacker would somehow know where those bricks were, and he'd just reach out in midair and grab those 4 incoming and stack them properly, and without looking, turn and grab the next 4. It was an incredible choreography that those 2 guys did. It was really amazing, and they worked hard and sweat, and they earned maybe, well, I heard various tales, but they'd earn another $20 or $25 a week, which is an enormous amount. But they certainly did earn it. And then when the bricks were baked after about a week or 10 days, they'd open the kiln and go in and start unloading. And these bricks were still hot, and they'd just reverse the process. Only this time the stacker would throw 4 to the wheelman, and the wheelman would load them into the wheelbarrow and wheel them to the boxcars that were parked nearby on a siding. And when they got into the boxcars, they had to put straw between each layer. So they had to unload manually every brick, the first layer on the floor of the boxcar, and then scatter straw over that layer, and then put another layer on top, and so forth. Of course, the steel mill had to reverse the process and handle every one of them again, so it was very inefficient. Of course, today everything is mechanically done, and they have continuous kilns where they load the greens in the one end and they come out the other end fully cooked and mechanically handled. And they palletize them now and wrap them with plastic and so forth, so it's all done properly and with far fewer people. A couple of incidents that are kind of funny happened at the brickyard. There was a guy that worked up high in the roof. His workstation was up at the bins, and I don't know what he did up there, but I saw him climb the ladder up to the ceiling, up pretty high, maybe 40, 50 feet. And he'd be up there all shift, and he'd come down to take a break once in a while, and then that's where he spent his work day, by himself up there. Well, I started working there, and of course I put my lunch bucket with the rest of the guys in the little shed-like place where we could eat in there if we wanted to, although it was pretty crowded and dirty and full of junk. So rarely did we ever eat in there, but anyway, that was the place where we put our coats and our lunch buckets. But I noticed that some days some of my lunch was missing. So I knew somebody was stealing it, but I wasn't overly troubled about it until one day when the whole thing was missing, the whole bucket. There wasn't anything in my bucket, and I didn't have any lunch at all. And of course, in those days, I was a skinny, hungry kid, and working as hard as I did. I needed my lunch, and there wasn't a restaurant around or a place to buy anything, so I had to do without, and I didn't like that at all. So I told my mother, so she decided to make some sandwiches that maybe he'd enjoy. So she used a very harsh soap called Octagon soap, and it was in a fairly large bar, and it was shaped in a kind of an octagon shape, and it was yellow. It looked like processed cheese. So she made 2 sandwiches out of it, generous slices, of course, of cheese, and then liberally saturated with red pepper, and she put mustard over that whole mixture to conceal the obvious inedibles in there. So she packed my lunch, and I don't know if she put any dessert in there that day or not, but anyway, she packed it, and those 2 sandwiches. And so, and then she packed me a regular lunch that I left in the car. So at lunchtime, we were sitting around, 4 or 5 of us were sitting there eating, and pretty soon we heard swearing and cursing, and then some vomit coming down from the station up above us. Oh, we knew he had fallen into the trap and taken a bite or 2 of that pretty bad sandwich. That was the end of the theft, although that night, when I went to get my lunch bucket, somebody had driven 2 big spikes through the bottom of it and nailed it to the board that was in there. And so I just pulled it free and closed the holes with a hammer and bent the metal back in shape. But that same guy had a Model A Ford, so we decided to get some revenge on him. So one night after it got dark, and I was working a second shift, from 3 till midnight or whatever the hours were. So after dark, we went out there, another guy and I, and we jacked up the old Model A. We put some bricks under the rear axle, just high enough so that the wheel wasn't touching. So we all, of course, at the end of the shift, everybody's anxious to get out of there and get home. And he was always an early bird, and so he's out. When we got out there, he was already in his car and gunning the motor. He couldn't figure out what was wrong. He thought something was broken in it, and it wouldn't go. He finally saw what was wrong, and he gave the old car a push and got it off the pile of bricks and went on his way. But we all got a good laugh. Everybody was standing around and giving him the raspberries. One of the workers that rode with us, Archie Frellin was his name, and he was pretty smart. And he had heard, as I had, that if you had Model T ignition coil and you hooked it to the body of the car and wired it in right, you could shock anybody that touched the car or trying to get into the car. And everybody thought that was really pretty clever, unique idea. Well, I didn't know that Archie had, on the QT, gotten a hold of a Model T Ford ignition coil and had hooked it to his dad's 39 Ford. And we'd ridden in that day in that Ford, and he had been the one driving, of course. And so he was out there in the Ford before everybody else. And there were a couple other guys in the car already. I don't know whether he fried them or not, but when I came up to it and grabbed the door handle, he turned that thing on, and boy, I tell you, I couldn't move. I just stood there with my mouth open, and I couldn't let go of the handle. I could hear the buzzing sound of the coil box, and I knew what he had done, because I'd heard that noise before. So he left me hang there for, well, not long, 20 seconds maybe or something. Well, they were all sitting there in the car laughing their butts off at me. My partner at the slopping out table and I had become aware that there were periodically available miscellaneous jobs around the place that paid a nickel more an hour. And so we had no idea what was involved with that, but we kept haranguing the foreman for a chance at one of these special jobs that were periodically available. And of course he ignored us almost always. He never bothered stopping to talk to us at all anyway. But in any case, one day he came over and he says, "All right, you two dummies, I've got a job for you." So he said, "Follow me." So we went over to the shed where the tools were and where we kept our lunch buckets and so forth. And on the wall there was an old handsaw. I'm sure it was well early in the century when it was built, and of course it was rusty and had bend in it. And there was a hammer there hanging on the wall too, with a taped up handle, of course. And he told us that, he told me to get the saw and the hammer, and for us to get aprons and fill our pockets full of nails, and to follow him. So, this sounded pretty exciting. So we followed him across the cinder-covered yard there and out into the place where there was a railroad spur there, where their products were shipped in and out. And on that railroad spur was a boxcar. The rails were probably 2 or 3 feet above the ground level surrounding the spur. There was a slope there, and they had to put some fill in there to keep the tracks reasonably level. And so we came up to the boxcar, and he reached up and opened the door, and the floor of the boxcar was about our eye height, about head high. And we looked up, and the doorway was boarded, closed off with boards, and we could see some sand trickling out between the cracks in the boards. And the boxcar was full of sand, and I've often wondered how they filled that boxcar with sand, but nevertheless it was full almost up to the roof. And our task, if we accepted it, it was to, according to him, and this is almost verbatim what he said to us, I want you two a-holes to build a ramp from this boxcar over to the window in an adjacent building, which is about 30 feet away or so, and unload this boxcar. And he said, over there's a pile of lumber, and you get to work. And you have till tomorrow at this time to get the ramp built and the boxcar partially empty anyway, or you don't get any bonus. So, of course, that nickel an hour to us was a pretty exciting incentive. But, boy, I took a look at it, and I wasn't a very experienced carpenter by any fantastic stretch of the imagination, but I had quite a bit of experience there on the farm doing work and so forth, and I knew how to use a handsaw. But I knew that handsaw was a loser because it was dull, and worth being bent didn't help the situation any either. But when I looked it over to that pile of haphazardly stacked lumber, and it was probably the fourth offfall from the sawmill because it was I could see that there was some oak in it and who knows what else, but it was a mixture of breeds of tree, that's for sure. And of course, and it had been sitting out there in the weather for quite some time because it was all weather beaten, and it was a sorry looking pile of lumber. But I also knew that you couldn't drive a nail into a dried oak board. That it just couldn't be done. The nail wasn't strong enough to withstand the hardness of that board. And I could see quite a few warped and broken. It was a terrible mess. And with that detailed and very explicit instruction, he left us there. So there, my partner was a couple years older than I, but I was 15, so you could see what a pair we were. But anyway, we went over to the lumber pile and started to drag some boards over. Of course, I had no idea how to build a ramp high enough to get up to that boxcar door opening, and to make it strong and safe enough for us to use a wheelbarrow to wheel that sand from the boxcar across that ramp into the window of that building. It was the brick building with a big window knocked out of it, and that was to be our destination. So I had some idea on what to do, but I wasn't a trained construction engineer, so it was a lot of maybe we got to do it this way or that way, or how are we even going to get it started? And looking at the impossibility of nailing that stuff together, we both knew we were doomed. So, but we did try. We got some boards nailed up, vertical legs and so forth. Got a little bit done, but it was obvious that wasn't going to work. It was a stupid idea to start with. But in any case, we piddled around there for 2 or 3 hours, and he finally came back and he saw that our efforts were totally negligible. He went on a rampage again, and he kicked us off the job. He said, "You're not getting any bonus." And of course, we knew that. But anyway, my construction career was put on abeyance there after that. I had to ride my bike about 3 miles over to catch my ride every day. Of course, I rode over in the afternoon. I always managed to get there early because they wouldn't wait. If you weren't there on time at the agreed time, they left. I had to, otherwise everybody would be late. So I had to be sure that I was there on time. The other guys were on the route to the brickyard, so they got picked up at their houses, but I was in the wrong direction, so I had to ride my bike there to catch it. But riding over was fine, it was all summertime and no problem. However, we didn't get back to the house until midnight or 1 o'clock. I don't recall exactly, but it was certainly well past. It was dark. It was in the night. So I had to ride my bike home in the dark. And during the war, batteries just weren't available. And so I didn't have any headlight. My headlight required a couple of A batteries. And so the idea of riding home at night on the paved road was fine. There was plenty of space where I could ride the paved road. But when I was riding the other 2 miles or so, or actually a little more than that, through the woods on the dirt road, where the canopy of the woods pretty well covered the road, it was pretty dark riding, even in the moonlight nights. So what I did was watch for the gap in the canopy and followed that. Of course, I knew the road like the back of my hand, so I wasn't inventing the wheel. And when I think about it, that I didn't hit a stone or some other object laying on the road, maybe a tree branch or something might have fallen down, but never once in those several 2.5 months or whatever it was that I had an accident or even a scare. Thank the Lord for watching over a dumb kid. I earned $286.66 for the total summer's effort, and this check stub is for 2 weeks. And from my earnings, I had to pay $5 a week for the 20-mile ride in Preldon's car, and so I've netted $42.21 for 80 hours worth of work. I worked right up till the time to go to school that summer, and I never returned. So I think we'll end this one here, and we'll go to the next one.